Welcome to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media, where we are talking to the most important and interesting people in our new media age. I'm Max Tawney, media editor here at Semaphore. I am one of the hosts of Mixed Signals, and with me, as always, is the other host, our editor-in-chief, Ben Smith. How's it going, Ben?
It's good, Max. I feel like you're also one of the most interesting people. So, just to close the
Thank you very much. Well, that's why I'm on the show every week, and all of our guests are on the show just once. This week, we have somebody who's just maybe a little bit more interesting than me. It's Emily Maitlis, the beloved UK journalist, longtime presenter at the BBC, and co-host of the News Agents podcast. We'll talk to her about her role in the emergent British podcast space, her famous interview with Prince Andrew about Jeffrey Epstein and what that means in today's crazy Epstein news cycle, and why American TV interviewers are so disappointing today.
The British are such snobs about this, I gotta say.
Well, we'll decide if it's snobbery or if it's justified when we talk to Emily Maitlis right after the break. So, Ben, 2 weeks ago, you wrote something for our media newsletter about Jeffrey Epstein and how to think about the Epstein conspiracies and whether the media was kind of too obsessed with these kind of conspiracy theories. Some people had some opinions on what you had to say. What did you write about Epstein? How are you thinking about this new wave of coverage and kind of all of the political turmoil, chaos, and intrigue that's come along with it in Washington?
I guess I have two thoughts. And one is that it's obviously incredibly fun to watch people who peddled a bunch of nonsense conspiracy theories to get hoisted on their own petards. Like, that's just eternally entertaining. And I think for that reason, because Democrats see a political opportunity, there's a kind of universal consent that everyone should just dive in with the most credulous possible view of the idea that Jeffrey Epstein was running like a global blackmail scheme on behalf of the Mossad. I may have lost track of where it is today, but that's the general idea. And to me, it's QAnon for people with college degrees. It's a theory that if you look at the details briefly, it seems like, oh, this all must, fit together on the whiteboard. But there's a reality that investigative agencies in every country and every investigative journalist in the world have gone after this for like 10 years, 15 years, depending on who. Ghislaine Maxwell is sitting in jail, presumably because she couldn't hand over evidence about whichever, global oligarch is involved at the heart of this scandal because she didn't have any. And there's so many sort of specific reasons that different groups that ought to know better are peddling the most extreme versions of of this conspiracy theory. But I do think people who want to live in reality need to be a little careful about it and to really try to confine yourself to what is known, which, by the way, is pretty appalling, pretty interesting.
So then how should we think about our guest on the show this week, Emily Maitlis? She is obviously a very famous British journalist, former anchor for the BBC's Evening News, but also she's probably most famous to people here in the US and around the world for her interview with Prince Andrew about Epstein. And I mean, I'm not a tinfoil hat guy. I'm kind of an anti-conspiracy theorist. I tend to think that people are generally too dumb or have too big of mouths to keep a really good secret. As a journalist, that's my belief, given the fact that, people tell me secrets and things that they shouldn't be saying all day. Nothing as big as this, of course. But I came away from that interview thinking, oh my God, this guy, Prince Andrew, is guilty of something for sure. I mean, he came away seeming guilty. So why should we think then that people's obsession with Epstein is ridiculous if this was a huge media moment in which a large swath of the public thought that Prince Andrew had done something wrong? And indeed, then after this interview that Emily did with Prince Andrew, he had to step back from his royal duties, whatever that means.
Yeah, that we're not going to ever figure out what that is from this side of the Atlantic. I mean, no, and Emily got one of the huge scoops of the Epstein universe, and one of the few people who, among other things, was photographed with his arm around an underage girl, Prince Andrew, in Epstein's company, and and if you may not know Emily Maitlis because you're not a British news consumer. She's a central figure in British media, star host on the BBC, who then kind of shocked the world in 2022 by leaving to start a podcast called The News Agents, which is one of a few podcasts that have really come to dominate British media in a way that while podcasts in the US, they're interesting, they're everywhere, they're kind of the main alternative source of news. I think in the UK, The News Agents is like a central daily factual news program in a somewhat different way. Emily is portrayed in actually two recent fictionalized versions of her life, one called Scoop, one called A Very Royal Scandal, both focusing on her 2019 interview with Prince Andrew, in which she basically persuaded him it was an opportunity to talk about his charitable ventures, perhaps clear the air a bit about the Epstein stuff, and really pressed him very hard, very directly about what was going on, and kind of ended his career to the degree that you can do that to a royal. I am very interested in what she thinks watching this play out here now, 6 years later, and to what degree she buys or does not buy my skepticism about the kind of biggest picture theories.
Yeah, well, we'll have to figure out whether she agrees with you or she's ready to, be like me and put on her tinfoil hat. We talked a few weeks ago to Ari Aster, the director of Eddington, who said that we are all a nation of Jim Garrisons now. Jim Garrison being the lead investigator, a real guy, but made most famous by the movie JFK. And, I found myself actually moving in the opposite direction from you. I kind of felt, previously like this is not a big deal, but now after watching Emily's interview with Prince Andrew, I'm full Jim Garrison. But you know what? We've got Emily waiting for us, so why don't we call her up and see what she thinks right now?
Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely great to be here.
And as I introduced you, I realized you were like incredibly famous in Great Britain. And so for some of our audience, this is like very exciting. And in the way of broadcast, many people in the US have no idea who you are. And by way of introduction, you were a huge presenter on the BBC who totally shocked the world in 2022 by going off to do a podcast. And I guess that is a very familiar arc, and it's sort of something that a lot of the people we talk to are kind of wrestling with. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk us a little through that decision to leave the mothership.
Well, the first thing I'd say is if you're ever going to quit your job in a dramatic way, do it with a really good friend. Because it was a decision that three of us made at pretty much the same time. And so it had something of the kind of Thelma and Louise, driving off the edge of the cliff into the canyon feeling to it, because we were metaphorically holding hands as we took the biggest plunge of our professional lives at that point. And yes, I think a lot of people raised eyebrows. I had a very good job. I had a very central job. I was the lead presenter of BBC Two's Newsnight, which is our kind of flagship current affairs show at the BBC. And I think there was something that we felt was going on away from the world of television and sort of linear news. And partly it was, chats with the Director General in the kind of year up to it. And he was like, what are we going to do about numbers? What are we going to do about youth? What are we going to do about people watching? What are we going to do about our audiences? And I remember saying to him, like, weird sort of presence of mind, I was like, I will bring you the interviews and I will get the stories done and I will do you phenomenal, bits of television, but I cannot control the time that we're on or the platform that we're on or the channel that we're on. I cannot do that. That is all part of something much bigger than me. And actually, as it turned out, we found a whole new audience when we left. And it was a sort of audience that remarkably hadn't been like diehard into politics, hadn't been sort of obsessive about Westminster, wasn't, even a sort of daily news listener. We found lots of young people. We found moms on the school run. We found people who were kind of coming to news in a different way. And it's been sort of really reassuring, sort of invigorating, actually, to find whole different audiences in places that we didn't know we could reach.
Has that been kind of the biggest change moving from the evening news to podcasts? What are the ways in which not only has your job changed, but has your journalism changed, making the kind of platform shift?
I would say, first of all, my life has changed because I never used to go to bed before 1 a.m. We did late night news shows, and then you come off and you're absolutely buzzing, and you're kind of reading Twitter and you're reading comments and you're talking to your colleagues. And I sort of used to end the day kind of with a vodka and a panic attack normally, and very little sleep. And so the first thing that changed was like, oh my God, this is extraordinary. I can literally go to bed whenever I want. This is unbelievable. So it was a sort of life change first. And the audience thing has been really interesting because I think we've discovered 3 different audiences instead of one. I would say that linear television gave us the people who watch Newsnight. And occasionally it gave us, more than our normal people if we were doing something kind of niche or specific or whatever. But it generally gave us the people who watch Newsnight. And now we have a YouTube audience, which is very different to our podcast audience, which is very different to our clips, TikTok, Insta audience. And so we've kind of reached people in different ways. But I think the more profound question you're asking is, what do we do differently? And I think that the tone for an interview now is different. So we used to be very squeezed. When you're doing live television, you always sound urgent. And sometimes that's a good thing. And sometimes it just sounds rushed, to be honest. You're always trying to squeeze people. You end up sort of cutting into them, cutting over them. Sorry, but, we've got to go. Can I just rush it? Yes. And often people exploit that. If you're doing a senior member of the government, and they've worked out that you've got sort of 6 minutes max, then boy, do they kind of filibuster their way through the first answer and generally the last answer. And they will, they will give you a potted history of everything that they've, ever legislated on when you're trying to get to the kind of the nub of things. And so I guess the fact that people come in here, and as you can see, actually, it's a really comfortable studio. Our chairs are comfy. We give people hot beverages or iced coffee when they walk in. There is no rush. We don't sit there going, oh, we've got to get the weather. Can I hurry you, please? We've got to go. We have as much time for them as they have for us. And that changes, I think, the whole spirit of discourse. And what it generally means is that people leave happy. And that doesn't mean that we don't get to interrogate, a philosophy or a policy or a change or whatever. But it means that they have their chance to talk about, all the good things that they think it's doing or that it's done before we then kind of go, right, let's have some accountability. Let's go back and check on this. And so you tend to get something that is a bit more rounded. It feels less harried. It feels less taken out of context. I mean, isn't that the thing you always hear from politicians? Oh my God, they took this out of context. I can't believe that you quoted me out of context. And we don't. They have as long as they want to make their case. Yes, if it's kind of boring, we'll squeeze it down a bit. But generally, we get the best out of people by saying, yeah, no, you tell us your side, and then we'll ask you the questions about, why, whatever, 300,000 people have just signed a petition about your legislation overnight, or whatever it is.
Do you feel, I feel that too. Like my impulse in interviews often is just to hit people over the head immediately, and podcasts don't lend themselves to that. And in fact, I feel a certain amount of pressure, and I wonder if you do too, to be a little nicer here than I really probably am in my journalistic profession usually. And you've done some very tough interviews on television in your life, some very direct, very aggressive ones. And it feels to me like this medium, I don't know, favors being a little nicer. And I wonder, is that good? Is that good for journalism?
I think there are 2 things going on. One, quite often, I might have booked that guest myself, right? So you've put your sense of self on the line a bit. You've said, oh yeah, we'd love to talk to you about this. It'd be really interesting to hear about this. And so if you've done the booking, then you're kind of invested. Second, they come in, they're chatting, there is the sort of preamble beforehand, which doesn't lend itself so easily to you then turning around and going, why did you screw this up or whatever. But I think you've I can feel like in my solar plexus, I'm starting to kind of feel defensive because, you've touched on something that's really raw, which is nobody wants to turn to a podcast and feel that their journalism is suffering, or that they're not doing hard enough interviews, or that they're not doing the same job that they would have done on sort of linear television. And so I do keep reminding myself of that, and I mean, it's interesting. Like we did the Chancellor on the day that her budget came out last October. And I was really conscious. We had to go to, 11 Downing Street, and we were sort of setting up. And we had a camera problem, and we kept her waiting. And there was this awful moment where, because she'd been kept waiting, we were very apologetic. And I thought, oh God, this is going to kill the whole vibe. Like, how do you turn around to somebody and say, have you seen what the implications of your policy is going to be on, young workers coming into the workforce, blah, 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 blah. And so we actually kind of took a moment out, and we were like, we can apologize for being late, but we cannot let the journalism suffer, as a result of this. And it was a really hard-hitting interview, and rightfully so. I mean, about a policy that was kind of pretty catastrophic across the range. And sometimes you just need to kind of, I think, step out and have that little word with yourself. A podcaster doesn't mean that you let all your journalistic standards go out the window, or that you don't do the tough interviews, or that you sort of, you end up being so friendly with the guests because you put them yourself. It cannot mean that. Otherwise, we all sink.
As we were, thinking about doing this interview with you, I went back and I watched, obviously, the most famous interview you did, the one with Prince Andrew in 2019. As I was watching that, I was struck by the feeling that these are the types of marquee television interviews that you used to see, not all the time, but with some regularity. If somebody had a big story to tell, or they wanted to clear the air in some sort of way, they would say, okay, I'm going to go on the biggest news program, or the most serious news program, and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to explain it. And, it creates these really, really incredible and memorable moments. And I do think that that's not... There's memorable podcast interviews, but they don't have the flavor or of that, that big marquee interview style. Can you still kind of get big interviews on the show? And do these still, have we lost that type of, that big marquee television interview? Does that not exist anymore? And I don't, what's going to replace it?
Well, the first thing we decided when we started the podcast was that we were going to visualize everything. So, that was a big step for us. I mean, now it feels very obvious, but this was kind of 3 years ago. And we said, we cannot just be sort of, slightly crappy audio in somebody's garage. It has to feel like a studio. So our studio is pretty much set up for television, and it's a better lit studio than any of the TV ones I used to work in. And so I don't know if it gives you marquee, but I think it means that we take the visual side of things pretty seriously. And that if I'm asking a question, you should be able to see a cutaway of the interviewee's, face as I'm talking, because I think that's really, really key. That sort of all adds to what you're describing, which is the drama. When we first started, I remember an interviewer saying, do you ever think you'll do an Andrew interview? Would Prince Andrew ever come to a podcast? And I remember thinking, you've set me that test. That is going to be the test, isn't it? Would Prince Andrew ever do a podcast interview? And I think increasingly, actually, the answer would now be yes. The first interview with the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, we did on the show, was when he was in opposition. And the clips are still played. Like, a lot of the clips are still played and actually still resonate now with the answers that he gave on that day. And so, I mean, I don't think there's going to be much in my life that will compare to the Prince Andrew interview, in the sense of that kind of scale, an hour-long interview, in the middle of a palace. I mean, it's kind of not your average Thursday. But I would say that the stuff that we are doing now should still have that longevity, in terms of people remembering comments that were said and people remembering sound bites. And as I said, the Rachel Reeves Chancellor interview still gets played, in clips now. The stuff with Keir Starmer from 2022 still gets played. 23 maybe it was. But, so I sort of think we have to believe in our own medium a bit. We have to believe that if that is the the future, that we're going to still do the interviews as if they were going to be lasting testimonies of the journalism of the day. And obviously what we're competing with now is like, you know, Joe Rogan 3 hours, right? And that whole debate about whether, you know, Kamala Harris was going to do Rogan and was it too, you know, much out of her busy schedule, and what happens if somebody's kind of spouting conspiracy at you, and do you sit there kind of, you know, being a jock and being kind of fun, or do you say, no, you're talking absolute shite? You know, I think that is a whole sort of different question now. I mean, personally, I would say never do an interview that is 3 hours long, because it's only ever going to end in tears. But I think I still feel like a journalist in this studio. I don't feel like somebody who just sits and chats.
Do you think, I mean, there's a sense, and I think advertisers love this, podcasters, I think, are ambivalent about it, that it's really all becoming television, that it's all becoming indistinguishable, that, you know, your show is going to wind up licensed to Channel 4 and playing at, you know, 6 p.m. or something, and that for viewers and really for producers increasingly, this is all merging again. Do you buy that, and do you like the idea?
I don't dislike the idea, but I don't agree with it. Actually, I think it's much more fragmented. I mean, look, we have discovered recently, and we just had our biggest week last week on YouTube, right? And I think I feel confident saying that the people who watch us on YouTube are not the same people that listen to us when they get out of work at 5 o'clock. You know, our podcast comes live at 5 p.m. every day. So we get a lot of people kind of in the lift, leaving work, you know, going home, on the tube, on the bus kind of thing, taking us as their afternoon commute. Then we get another kind of lot of you know, the morning dog walkers, the runners, etc. But I think the YouTube watchers have now got us on their TV screens, right? And it's a totally different, it tends to skew male, it tends to skew older, sort of 50 to 65. And they are now our sort of fastest growing, as it were, TV YouTube audience, which is totally different to the kind of the students or the young people that we talk to in their ears.
Well, speaking of males 50 to 65, we got to talk about the Jeffrey Epstein story. How was that transition? And you obviously you played a big role in it, I think, in blowing up the Prince Andrew part that had been sort of lurking around the edges of it. I mean, I think in some sense he's the only really major figure who has been really directly tied to Epstein and faced big consequences. And people who want to know more about your role in this should watch A Very Royal Scandal on Prime, which is quite amazing, which you worked on. But I wonder, looking right now as Washington is totally consumed by this scandal that's really been rolling in various ways since the early 2000s, what does this Washington moment look like from where you sit?
People here are absolutely transfixed. I mean, we've seen that in our numbers over the last week. And I think it's probably because it kind of has everything. So if you're a political geek, you're just fascinated by the Trump MAGA divide. You know, if anyone had ever thought that Trump would be divided from his base, I don't think they would have thought it would be over a conspiracy theory that he unleashed that he couldn't follow through. So you've got all the kind of, you know, people who feel it's worth their time politically to look at this because of what it's telling you about that kind of the sort of the damage limitation exercise that Trump is failing so badly right now in Washington. And then I think you've got people who started off thinking that it was all a conspiracy and then kind of going, hang on, actually, I don't think I know enough about this. I've now remembered a name. I've now remembered the 2008 Florida suit. I've now remembered the role that Tina Brown played in this with, you know, was it the Daily Beast and how that all begun. I've now remembered that I don't know how Epstein got his money. And so there's the whole kind of, I suppose there's the whole, like, what was the story in the 90s that I completely missed, right? What was the story with the models? What was the story with the contracts? What was the story with Trump and the party and all that stuff that people genuinely want to kind of fill in the gaps for? And I think there's also, you know, when we first started talking about the Epstein case, it was pre-Me Too, right? And I think there's now a moment where your jaw drops and you just go, what the actual fuck? right? Like, how many hundreds of victims were going through his hands? And why do we only know so few? And why do we only know him? And why are there so few names publicly? And certainly I think for the younger generation who, might have missed some of the early stuff, they're kind of going, I don't understand why this is okay, right? It is not okay. It is not okay to have not got to the bottom of this for the victim's sake and for the sake of truth and for the sake of all the people whose stories have been erased. And I think that's probably something that we understand much better in 2025 than we would have done in sort of 2014, 2015.
Well, we have to take a break, but we will be back with a lot more with Emily Maitlis right after this.
This week on our branded segment from Think with Google, we've got Google's VP of Marketing, Josh Spanier, for the third part of our series on how modern marketing is more than just AI. So Josh, we've talked about two pieces of modern marketing. First, just the fundamentals. Second, understanding the customer. What to you is the third piece?
Embracing technology. Modern marketing really is about understanding how digital technologies and more have fundamentally changed how we all engage with the world. And maybe it's an old thought going back to Henry Ford and the Model T, but what we see at Google is marketers who embrace technology in all its forms and shapes drive much higher business outcomes across everything they're doing. But it's more than just AI. AI is obviously the hot technology of the moment, but it's actually thinking about technology in its broader sense. So the use of the cloud. So we use Google Cloud to create collaboration, to speed up our working processes. It means thinking about video across all its different surfaces, not just YouTube, but also demand gen and across search even. And it's also thinking about all the AI elements, both in video production and beyond, to speed up our workflows. I'm particularly excited about that third one because AI is so fascinating and interesting. So products like VO are really just transforming the creative production game.
Yeah, VO is quite amazing. What excites you about it from a marketing perspective?
It's just really hard not to get super excited about the unbound creativity that VO makes all of us. We can all be creative directors. We can all imagine ideas and then using VO make audio visual films instantaneously, almost in real time, to solve for any need or any moment. The NBA Finals just happened here in the United States. A number of advertisers used VO to make the ads they put onto television, and they did it in a matter of hours. It's just really inspiring to see how this technology is evolving so rapidly. And since we last spoke about VO, Ben, we've actually sent out a new update where you can upload just a picture and turn a picture into a audio-visual film in a matter of seconds. It's really fun. Recommend everyone try playing around with it.
What are organizations that are adapting this successfully doing? What are they doing right?
Organizations that are adapting AI successfully are finding the people in an organization who are leaning into these technologies, who are passionate and inspired about using it, and letting them run riot, letting them get free rein to produce stuff. You obviously have to have human choice in what you actually put out in the world and put money behind. But the creativity, the spark, the speed, find your best people, empower them, look at what they're doing, and play around with the technologies yourself.
If people want to see what that looks like in action, where should they go?
Head on over to thinkwithgoogle.com. There are multiple case studies and examples of using VO, of using generative AI, of using Google Cloud, and of using YouTube and search to do all sorts of interesting things which will drive business outcomes over at thinkwithgoogle.com.
Thanks, Josh.
I want to try out a theory on you because it's something I've been really thinking about. And it seems to me that, the reason the interview resonated so much and is so fascinating is because it is one of the rare, I think a lot of people came away from the interview watching Prince Andrew's responses and thought, this guy's probably guilty. Like, he probably did some of the stuff and he's probably lying. I'm really curious. I mean, were you thinking the same thing as he was responding and the way he was responding to you?
No, I wanted the interview to be absolutely forensic. And I didn't want to bring any of my judgments or prejudgments into it at all. And that was really important, actually, to us as a team, that we treated it like we were gathering evidence in case it would ever go to trial. And that was all it was ever meant to be, And I remember talking it through with my editor at the time, Esme Wren, about the order of how we want to ask the questions. And I said, we have to establish the building blocks, right? We have to get the facts down first. Were you, ever on the jet? Were you on the island? Do you remember this? Did you go to his house? We have to actually build up the case of things that we know. Because the danger with those interviews is if you bring your own preconceptions or your own sort of assumption of guilt, you kind of cut through the early stuff. You make a statement. That statement's then refuted. And everyone kind of goes, oh, she got that wrong, didn't she? She didn't know what she was talking about. Oh, he's just said he wasn't there in 2007 because you got it wrong and it was 2008. And so the thing that I really wanted to make sure when we did that was it was absolutely fact-based. And it was fact-based to him so that he was confirming things that I was asking.
Just for the record, you've been on his private plane.
Yes.
You've been to stay on his private island.
Yes.
You've stayed at his home in Palm Beach.
Yes.
You've visited Ghislaine Maxwell's house in Belgravia in London.
Yes.
And if you kind of, if you look at the first 10 minutes of it, and there is a moment when I asked the first question and his answer is kind of too long. And I remember thinking, I take myself back there right now and I think, oh my God, I've got 50 minutes with him. Like, what happens if each answer is that long and I don't get to ask my questions? I was really nervous that I would sort of get run over. And then I come back and I say, I'm almost doing my checklist. This. Can you confirm that? Can you confirm that? Did he go to your daughter's birthday party? And there's that moment where, one of the most famous lines in it now is a straightforward shooting weekend.
Am I right in thinking you threw a birthday party for Epstein's girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, at Sandringham?
No, it was a shooting weekend.
A shooting weekend?
Just a straightforward shooting weekend.
And just the clash between most people in Britain not finding a shooting weekend very straightforward, but him thinking that he'd clarified for me why my question was wrong, right? I never threw a party for Epstein. It was just a straightforward shooting weekend. But that kind of stuff was fundamental to the arc of the interview because it allowed me to say, you've confirmed that, check. You've conceded that, check. I understand that you were there at the time of that, check. So my dates are right, my names are right, my locations are right. Now I can ask the questions. And I think I needed that base, that structure in which to then build the interview. And so if you say to me, I still would never say to you, I think he's guilty. I wouldn't say I think he's innocent. I'd just say that wasn't my role. As a journalist, I was just there to ask the questions.
So, but you have had now 6 years to think about it and talk about it, and you've read a lot. And I think one of the reasons that the Andrew story is so interesting right now is I think that there is this sort of haze around what was Epstein's relationship with these men? What was the value exchange? What was Andrew getting out of it? What was Epstein getting out of it? And I guess I wonder if in this case, what was Jeffrey Epstein getting out of this relationship?
Yeah. Look, I can tell you what the theories are, which is that, this is one of the ones we explore in the drama. And I say that because, we explore it in a fictional sense because there is some sense but no factual evidence that there was kind of money, there was a loan at the bottom of it. There was possibly, a connection with Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's wife, and whether she'd borrowed money off Epstein and what was going on there was, I don't know if it was monetary. But I guess what you're asking is a much bigger question. And going back, I think that's why the Epstein story resonates so much because we just don't know this stuff. If you look at the passenger flight lists, don't you want to know what every single person was doing on that flight with Epstein, right? Isn't that the starting place? Why were you going to the island? Why were you meeting in St. Bart's? Why was he lending money? Why did one guy hand over his fortune to Epstein and let him just decide how the money was spent? Maybe that's completely normal. I know a lot of financiers do work like that, but I think for many people, is kind of shocking and we just don't know any of it. And so in a way, the fact that you had this hour with Prince Andrew took us to the heart of one relationship, maybe two, Ghislaine Maxwell as well, one relationship and one set of events and what happened over the course of a decade and a half. But how many other people are out there that we're not talking about, that we haven't managed to do those interviews with, that we haven't investigated, that have shut down the story, or the people who, frankly, are no longer with us, who have taken secrets to the grave about what they were doing with Epstein. I feel like we are tip of the iceberg here, and that's, I think, why it still resonates with people, not just the conspiracy theorists, but the people who are like, how could one man have had up to 1,000 victims, and we know so little? We know still so little of what actually went on.
The interview that you did with Prince Andrew obviously changed both of your lives. Have you spoken to him since then?
No, I've spoken. I mean, it won't surprise you to hear that I have a lot of conversations with people who tell me about their own relationship with Prince Andrew and fill in some of the gaps for me. And so I constantly get people saying, "Oh, you'll never guess who I'm shooting with this weekend." And I say, no, I will. Believe me, I will. Or I'll say, "You'll never guess who was really rude to me." Believe me, I will. People see me coming, and there's kind of, there's the anecdote. But I piece together some of the story from people who came to find me after the interview and told me what had happened. Subsequently as a result, including the moment that the late Queen read the transcript on the Saturday morning. It was shown, prime time Saturday evening, but the Queen, we understand, read it Saturday morning. And there was a moment at which she then sent her people to pull Andrew out of a lunch. And that was kind of the last he was seen publicly. And so I learnt about that much later from people who'd been at the lunch, around the lunch, So it's kind of weird. No, we've never spoken. Occasionally I find myself in the same room as his daughters, and I feel terrible, actually. Those moments, I just there's normally a very sort of quiet, elegant dance where I try and get to the other end and leave them in peace, because I sort of think, that's a photo they probably don't need.
Well, I would actually, anytime you sort of mention the British royals, I feel like we could probably, we're all obsessed with them over here secretly, and we could probably go on all day about that. But I wonder if we could, I'd be curious of your I know that you're obsessed with the United States. I saw you at that kind of hallucinatory Republican National Convention
this time last year. That's right.
Yeah, in Milwaukee this time last year. And I'm curious right now how the U.S., and actually really specifically the U.S. media, like, how do we look from your vantage point?
Oh, I mean, look, there's so many bits to that, right? So we look at the White House press briefings and we're like, Jesus, who's left in there asking real questions, right? So that's one thing. We're kind of like, is it Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend again? Who's got the top question this time? Like, who is literally asking the question that we're all kind of dying to hear the answer to?
Sorry, to be clear for the listeners, Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend is actually in the White House press pool.
He's Breitbart, isn't he?
No, he works for, I think, it's like Real America's Voice. It's a similar ideological disposition, I would say.
In case you thought Emily was joking.
Yeah, no, I know this is true. I mean, I'm sorry. I feel sorry. I'm diminishing because I can't remember his name, but I remember thinking this is an awkward position for us to have him as our filter of the answers to the questions we all really want to ask. So there's that. Then we're kind of trying to make sense of like the payouts, the George Stephanopoulos, the 60 Minutes. I don't know if Steve Colbert fits into that. We've been trying to work out in our own way what is kind of, real media change and what is quiet censorship. And then actually I read and I consume so much stuff coming out of the US media, which I love. I think the writing is superb, and I think the analysis is absolutely gripping. And so, I mean, what's the answer to that? The answer is, I think the US style of political interview is very different to ours, broadcast wise. But I think the writing is unparalleled.
I was watching some of the interviews, the recent interviews that you've done. You did one at the RNC last year with Nigel Farage. I watched a recent interview that you had with a conservative MP on your show about these Pakistani groom gangs. I don't even want to know. I don't want to know what that is.
He's not. Just to say, he's not conservative. He's not conservative. He's an MP who basically got kicked out of the Reform Party, Nigel Farage's party.
Fair enough. I guess on the political right, I guess we would. Yeah. I forget we have to make those kind of distinctions. But I guess what I came away thinking was that it was amazing that some of these guys were willing to do interviews with you, and that they were willing to. And that you could kind of express some viewpoints, or be a little bit, have some personality in these interviews in a way that nowadays you really just don't see that in American broadcast television anymore, or just in many interviews, just simply because political figures on the right are just not taking the time to speak with a lot of journalists or people in American media who are not ideologically aligned with them. I'm curious, do you think that British politicians face tougher questions than US politicians?
I really do. Yeah. And actually, I have to say, I have a quiet respect for our politicians, because we give them complete shit, and they're still really lovely afterwards, and they'll still come up to you at a drinks party and have a chat, and they'll be fine, because we manage to, I think, delineate between, I'm just, I would always go back to, I'm just doing my job, right? I'm just asking the questions that everyone sitting at home kind of is thinking. So I'm just doing my job. This doesn't mean I hate you. This doesn't mean I won't break bread with you. It's a totally different thing. And I would, weirdly, I had a chat at a sort of somebody's garden party with Nigel Farage, when all we talked about was his appearance on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, So I don't carry it into a different world, but I do think that in the studio, or, in an interview chair, I have to do my job properly and thoroughly. And I won't shy away from that. And I guess I go back and forward, and I'm going to be maybe slightly too honest here, but I occasionally listen to like the Sunday shows, the US Sunday shows, and I'm kind of screaming at them. I don't understand why you don't follow up on a question, right? You've asked one question, and then you hear the interviewer go, let's move on. And we're all kind of going, no, do not move on. Do not move on. That was not an answer. Like, please go back. Do you not understand what they just said? They're trying to move you on, and you're moving on. And I suppose I can see what the argument is, which is like, oh, you want them back on your morning show. So you kind of softball them and you say thank you, and everyone starts going happy Mother's Day and happy this day and happy Thanksgiving Day. You spend half the interview thanking everyone for whatever appearance that they're making. And then there's sort of no grit to the actual argument. And I don't think I'm alone. Like, this side of the pond, we find that really odd. We're like, Jesus, you've got this person in front of you. You've got the Speaker of the House. For Christ's sake, like, ask him all the questions that you've been dying to ask for 6 months, because they're not going away. And yet the whole thing is sort of slightly polished and veneered, and I don't want to upset anyone, and happy Mother's Day. So I honestly, we just don't get it. But I guess the answer to it is, if you ever do a proper interview with somebody, a high-ranking politician, in Congress or whatever, they don't come back. I mean, I hope, is that true? If that's true, I'm really sad about that.
I think part of that is true. But part of it is just that since Trump, and this predates Trump a little bit, but it's part of the political project on the right to kind of, push back against the media, in some cases delegitimize the media. And so I think that's part of kind of what's going on here. I'm curious, has it changed at all on the political right in the UK? Has the political right become more hostile towards the media and towards the press there, as in a similar way to the American right's hostility towards the media here?
Do you know, I don't think it has. I mean, I get that people will naturally go to their silos. So we have a channel called GB News, which for a long time was actually hosted by working MPs, politicians on the right who were doing the job of being our parliamentarians and our chat show hosts, which is kind of weird, right? But you will tend to have politicians of the right going to GB News first because they will not be given as hard a time, and I guess it's the foxification. They'll tend to have people nodding in agreement rather than pushing back. That said, I don't think that we haven't yet heard enemies of the people stuff, right? We just haven't. I mean, in terms of the press, we haven't yet heard lying press. We haven't yet heard, you're obviously online, all the rest of it, but not really from the mouths of politicians themselves. And I don't know whether that's because we still have a centre of sorts. We have a state broadcaster in the BBC. And however frustrated people get with it and what it stands for, or which kind of, which way it sort of appears to be prioritising stories, I think it is still the sort of broadcaster that kind of, ties a lot of the middle together, right? Now, I don't know whether that means the extremes just don't come towards it, don't hear about it. But I don't know. I feel that we are not in that same place. We're not in the place where the press just get denigrated for covering anything.
Yeah, I guess the BBC does create a kind of shared reality that I think we don't have here.
I think that's true. Maybe it's just that everyone uses the BBC as a punch ball, right? Everyone's got their own reason for kind of being mad. And so, it's a unifying thing. But yeah, I think that's right. I think if I would always go to the BBC to fact check something. I would always read their copy still to find, numbers or to get the background or whatever. And I hope that, a lot of people feel that way, which I think, I hope keeps some of the kind of conspiracy stuff at bay. But really what you're talking about is, maybe it's just the pool of journalists is smaller still, right? So you kind of don't want to isolate all the journalists by saying, you're all lying about everything all the time.
Well, Emily, I'd say that you're a representative rather than a fringe figure in the future of media, which we talk a lot about here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
I'm curious, Max, if you were kind of satisfied with her analysis of the Epstein stuff of Prince Andrew, and really that sense that there's a lot more there.
I still think that she's behaving she may be a podcaster, but she still is a straightforward, journalist in many ways. She's like, hey, look, I'm here to collect the facts and, prosecute the case, or, looking at it through that lens and not through the podcaster lens. If she was a true podcaster, she'd be putting the tinfoil hat on, with the rest of us, going deep down the conspiracy rabbit hole and delivering a verdict, right? And that so often is the difference between the podcaster and the traditional interviewer.
Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but this is what's so interesting about British media right now, is that for in the US, the podcasters are sort of all orbiting what's still a kind of shrinking but real kind of like mainstream fact-based space, and then we podcasters are there to analyze it. In Britain, Emily and her colleagues really manages to seize a big part of that central factual, just the facts, ma'am space from the BBC. And as you say, they don't sound like podcasters. They sound like broadcasters. I don't know, and it's been it's a very different path than the U.S. Actually, I think another show, Rest is Politics, has a bit of that as well. They're kind of authoritative establishment figures who are now on a different medium, but still carry all of that veneer of authority. Where I think in U.S. podcasts, it's a much more sort of like it's curiosity. It's sort of an alternative point of view.
The other thing is that space, that central journalism-y space, was just seized by like the New York Times and like the Wall Street Journal and NPR, which have just the most successful straight just the news kind of podcasts in something like The Daily.
Yeah, I suppose that's right.
The other thing that I found to be really interesting and fascinating was the comparisons that she made between the ways in which UK media has changed in response to kind of political attacks, mostly from the right, on media and criticisms of the mainstream media. It was interesting for me to hear this kind of alternative universe that exists in which, yes, a lot of people still have complaints about media bias and liberal media bias, but that hasn't extended into the realm of enemy of the people. What did you make about her distinction there between the U.S. media and British media?
I think it's incredibly interesting. I mean, it's really the two different societies are very different. I mean, in Britain, fundamentally, the sort of establishment has held, and you see it in a lot of ways. When Liz Truss, did some very unorthodox things with her budget, she was basically run out of town by the sort of establishment of British politics, which was the media and was the politicians and was the finance industry, and she was just gone almost immediately. And there's no such mechanism in the U.S. There are no kind of, this is what people like to call guardrails. There's no sense that there are certain rules that political figures have to follow and they're enforced by the media, basically. But the barbarians are like definitely at the gate over there. And I think it's a question of, does that center hold, or does a kind of real anti-establishment and anti-media wave, maybe it just hasn't broken there yet.
Part of it, I think, is that the right there just isn't as good or as effective at creating this kind of alternate, interesting media ecosystem. I mean, I was watching GB News, which she mentions during the interview. I was actually watching a GB News panel about Emily, about one of her interviews, which they found to be offensive, and just watching the clips of this, I'm like, these guys just aren't as good at this as Tucker Carlson is, and they're just not as good at this as Sean Hannity or some of these other guys. And so I think there's a possibility that somebody could kind of figure it out. They tried to do it with Piers Morgan, right? Because he was kind of a part of this, and he still is just too interested in doing journalism and kind of these interesting interviews, and it ultimately is not as conservative as people on the right here. And so I think part of it is just that they just haven't quite figured out how to do it as effectively as we have. And I think the other part is something that she mentioned, which is that it's a smaller country. The media ecosystem is smaller. People know each other there. You're going to be in rooms with the people who you cover a lot, right? I mean, this is something that you always say about British media, Ben. Like when I went to London, you were like, it's so crazy that everybody here just knows each other and they all know the members of parliament and they all went to uni together. That's got to be creating some of those guardrails that you were talking about.
Yeah, they were all debating each other at the Oxford Union, so they can then switch on this very intense, heated, and sometimes personal debate mode on television, which, I mean, honestly, I'm not sure a lot of American politics and journalists, myself included, are really capable of that kind of sparring. But certainly, if you were to go at each other that hard, very few of them would then, walk out and head right to the pub.
Well, Ben, thanks for booking Emily. I thought that was really great, and it was great to get that kind of perspective from across the pond, as they say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, actually, from British media right now.
Well, that's it for us this week. Thank you, as always, for listening to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Sheena Ozaki, with special thanks to Josh Billinson, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, Jules Zern, and Tori Kaur. Our engineer is Rick Kwan, and our theme music is by Billy Libby. Our public editor is Tobin Andre, the communications secretary for The Crown.
And if you like Mixed Signals, please do follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe.
And if you still want more, you can always sign up for Semaphore's media newsletter out every Sunday night.